And in other words, when the decision was made that Dick York could no longer continue,
They lit up living rooms in the 1960s with their spellbinding chemistry on Bewitched, captivating millions as television's most enchanting couple. But behind the charm and laughter, Elizabeth Montgomery was carrying a secret about Dick York, a truth that would shadow her for decades. Beneath the perfect sitcom, smiles were whispers of hidden feelings, subtle tensions, and moments so charged they blurred the line between acting and reality. Off camera, there were glances that lasted too long, conversations that felt too personal, and a connection neither of them fully acknowledged in public. And then, years later, came a revelation Elizabeth had kept locked away, one that would shatter the illusion fans thought they knew. Stay tuned, because once you discover what was really happening between these two icons, you will never see their on-screen marriage, or Bewitched, the same way again. From the moment Dick York first stepped onto the Bewitched set as Darren Stevens, something unspoken began brewing behind the camera. The world saw a witty, devoted husband to Elizabeth Montgomery's Samantha, but York saw much more than a co-star. Crew members would later whisper about the way he looked at her, lingering glances, small smiles, and a softness in his voice when she was near. In quiet moments between takes, he would find reasons to be in her space, sparking rumors that his feelings for her went far beyond the script. At first, Elizabeth brushed it off as friendly warmth. She was used to male attention, especially in the mid-1960s television world, where leading ladies were often put on a pedestal. But this was different. York's puppy-dog infatuation, as one source later called it, didn't fade. It deepened with each episode, creating an unspoken tension that the cameras never caught. He never crossed a line in public, but his presence grew harder to ignore. Those who worked closely on set noticed Elizabeth's subtle shifts, a tighter smile during certain scenes, a quick step back when York leaned in too close. She valued professionalism, and maintaining that became more complicated as his admiration lingered just under the surface. Still, to millions of viewers, the Stevens marriage was the gold standard for sitcom couples, proof that TV magic could be seamless. Behind that illusion, though, Elizabeth began to feel a quiet pressure, not from any overt behavior, but from the constant undercurrent of attention that made every shared scene a balancing act. York's feelings were unspoken, yet visible enough for observant crew members to notice. This dynamic would shape the tone of their on-screen chemistry in ways even fans couldn't pinpoint. It wasn't just acting. It was York channeling something real, something Elizabeth had to navigate carefully. And as the seasons went on, this undercurrent only grew stronger. What neither of them knew was that this unspoken tension would become the seed of a much larger story, one that would resurface decades later, long after Bewitched had faded from the airwaves. And in the next chapter, that story would collide with York's personal battles in a way no one on set could have imagined. Long before Bewitched, Dick York's life took a devastating turn on the set of the 1959 film They Came to Cordura. In one brutal moment, while filming a scene that required him to lift and carry heavy railroad ties, he felt a sudden tearing pain shoot through his back. What seemed like a pulled muscle at first would turn out to be a permanent, life-altering spinal injury. He pushed through the discomfort at the time. Hollywood schedules left little room for rest, but the damage was already done. By the time he landed the role of Darren Stevens in 1964, the injury was a constant shadow. Long days on set, endless retakes, and the need to maintain a cheerful, energetic performance made every moment a battle. Painkillers became his quiet companion, the only way to survive grueling production schedules. But the side effects, fatigue, mood swings, and moments of mental fog were starting to seep into his work. Elizabeth Montgomery noticed. She saw him wincing between takes, subtly shifting in his seat to relieve pressure on his spine. She even mentioned in private conversations with crew members that she worried about how much pain he was hiding. But York's pride, and perhaps his feelings for her, kept him from ever asking for special treatment. To him, every scene with Elizabeth was worth enduring the discomfort, even if it meant pushing his body beyond its limits. As the years passed, the injury became more than a physical burden. York began experiencing bizarre hallucinations during his worst flare-ups, once telling a friend he could hear a band playing bagpipes night and day when the pain was at its peak. These moments unnerved those around him, but he brushed them off with a forced smile. Still, the cracks in his health were widening, and keeping up the perfect image of Darren Stevens was becoming impossible. What no one outside the set knew was that this slow decline was setting the stage for an abrupt and shocking exit from Bewitched. And when it came, it would leave Elizabeth Montgomery and millions of fans stunned. It happened without warning. One day, Dick York was on set, trading playful banter with Elizabeth Montgomery between takes. The next, he was gone, vanished from Bewitched, with no farewell episode, no public explanation, just a sudden replacement. For viewers at home, the switch to a new Darren felt abrupt, almost jarring. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more painful. York's back injury had reached a breaking point. The pain was no longer something he could push through with pills and willpower. During filming of the Season 5 episode Daddy Does His Thing in 1969, York collapsed on set. Crew members rushed to help as he lay on the floor, unable to move. That moment wasn't just a flare-up, it was his body demanding surrender. He was taken away and never returned to the show. There were no grand send-offs or public statements from the network. In that era, the industry was quick to sweep such situations under the rug, especially when it involved an actor's health. York's name quietly disappeared from scripts, and Dick Sargent stepped into the role as if nothing had happened. For Elizabeth, the transition was complicated. Professionally, she had to keep the show running, adapt to a new on-screen husband, and pretend everything was fine. Personally, she felt the absence of a co-star she'd worked beside for 5 intense years. Someone who, despite the undercurrent of unspoken feelings, had been a part of her daily life. Fans speculated endlessly. Some believed York had been fired over disagreements with producers. Others whispered about substance issues. Few knew the real depth of his suffering or the silent battles he'd been fighting. York himself rarely addressed the details at the time, choosing instead to fade quietly from the spotlight. But his departure was far from the end of the story. Away from Hollywood's bright lights, York's life would spiral into a period of financial ruin, health crises, and lonely obscurity, until Elizabeth's name would surface in his story once again, in a way that would spark decades of rumor and debate. After leaving Bewitched, Dick York's world shrank almost overnight. The man who had once been beamed into millions of homes each week now found himself confined to his own, battling constant pain and a body that refused to heal. Acting jobs dried up quickly. Few producers were willing to hire an actor who couldn't guarantee he could make it through a long shoot. The offers that did come were either physically impossible or so far beneath his former stature that accepting them felt like admitting defeat. His injury, once a hidden wound, had grown into a relentless adversary. Days were marked by stretches of bed rest, his movements measured and careful, each step a reminder of what he'd lost. To dull the agony, he leaned more heavily on prescription painkillers. They numbed pain, but also dulled his energy, leaving him caught in a cycle of exhaustion and dependency. Financial trouble followed. Without a steady income, York fell behind on bills. The steady stream of residuals from Bewitched wasn't enough to sustain him. Friends drifted away as the months turned into years. Hollywood's quick to celebrate its stars, but it's even quicker to forget them when the cameras stop rolling. And yet, there were moments of stubborn resilience. York took on voiceover work from home when he could, lending his warm, familiar tone to commercials and small projects. He also began writing, pouring his memories and reflections into a manuscript that would later become his autobiography. It was in these pages that he would reveal details about his pain, his hallucinations, and the quiet devastation of losing his career. Through it all, whispers about Elizabeth Montgomery floated in and out of his orbit. Some claimed she had reached out privately, offering support. Others swore she'd stayed away entirely, too focused on her own career and life to revisit the past. The truth remained unclear, and the uncertainty only fueled speculation. But as the 1980s drew to a close, York's name was about to resurface in a way no one expected, pulling Elizabeth Montgomery's memory into his story once more and igniting a rumor that still divides fans to this day. It started as a whisper, an unverified claim passed around in fan circles that Elizabeth Montgomery had visited Dick York in his final years. According to the story, she'd appeared unexpectedly at his modest Michigan home, a quiet, emotional reunion between two former co-stars who had shared so much screen time and so many unspoken moments. In this version of events, she told him she'd never forgotten him, and they parted with tears in their eyes. It was a touching image, too touching, perhaps. Over time, tales spread through TV nostalgia magazines, online forums, and later, social media posts. Some even claimed to have heard it from someone who was there. The problem? No one ever produced proof. No photos, no first-hand accounts, only vague recollections and third-hand stories that shifted with each retelling. Friends close to York have said flatly that it never happened. They maintain that in his last years, York's world was tightly controlled by his declining health and lack of mobility. Visitors were rare, and he spent most of his time either in bed or in a chair by the window. Those who knew Elizabeth insist she never made the trip, noting that she never once mentioned such a visit in interviews or personal writings. Still, the rumor refuses to fade. For some fans, the idea is too comforting to let go of. The notion that the magical on-screen couple had one final heartfelt moment off-screen before the end. It paints their story in softer colors, glossing over the tension, the injury, and the years of separation. York himself never publicly addressed the claim, whether from disinterest, respect for Elizabeth's privacy, or simply because it was untrue. He left the matter untouched. This silence only added fuel to the speculation, allowing the myth to grow unchecked. But in the shadows of this romanticized version lies a far more complicated truth, one tied to York's final battles with pain, poverty, and illness, and the way those final years stripped away the illusions Hollywood had built around him. That truth would emerge only after he was gone. By the early 1990s, Dick York's world had narrowed to the walls of his small Michigan home. His once towering frame was now frail, worn down by decades of pain and the toll of prescription medication. The back injury that had ended his career never healed. In fact, it had worsened, leaving him bedridden for long stretches. Even sitting upright for more than a few minutes was an exhausting ordeal. Yet in those final years, York found a new sense of purpose. He launched a charity effort called Acting for Life, using his voice and phone calls to help the homeless and raise awareness for those living on society's margins. From his bed, he made hundreds of calls to politicians, organizations, and potential donors. It was a quiet, stubborn act of defiance against the limitations his body had placed on him. Physically, though, his decline was relentless. York battled severe emphysema from years of heavy smoking, often gasping for breath after just a few sentences. Hospital stays became more frequent, and friends noticed he rarely spoke about his Hollywood days anymore. Whatever unresolved feelings lingered about Bewitched or Elizabeth Montgomery seemed locked away, replaced by the daily reality of surviving one more day. When he passed on February 20th, 1992, at the age of 63, tributes poured in from fans who remembered him as the charming, quick-witted Darren Stevens. Elizabeth Montgomery issued a brief public statement expressing her sadness and acknowledging his contribution to the show. For some, her words reignited the rumors about a secret final visit. For others, it felt like a respectful farewell to a chapter of her life she'd long since closed. But behind the polite statements and warm nostalgia, the truth of their relationship, its tensions, silences, and possible missed connections remained untouched. It was as if the curtain had fallen not only on York's life, but on the one story that had kept fans guessing for decades. And just 2 years later, a twist no one saw coming would bring Elizabeth Montgomery into her own final chapter, casting their entire shared history in a haunting new light. In the last years of her life, Elizabeth Montgomery began reflecting more openly on her career and the people who had shaped it. Interviews from the mid-1990s show a softer, more candid side. one less guarded than in her prime. While she rarely spoke directly about Dick York, those who knew her claimed that in private moments, she finally acknowledged the complicated truth about their time together. According to one close friend, Elizabeth admitted that she had been aware of York's feelings for her all along. She wasn't angry about them. If anything, she saw them as both flattering and tragic. Flattering because it meant their on-screen chemistry was real in some way. Tragic because it had created an invisible wall between them that neither dared to breach. She reportedly confided that she had wished circumstances had been different, his health stronger, his burdens lighter, so they could have enjoyed a deeper friendship without that tension hovering in the background. There were also hints that she regretted not reaching out to him in his final years. In one late conversation, she is said to have remarked, "I should have called." Whether this was connected to the persistent rumors of a secret visit remains unknown, but the statement added a bittersweet edge to the public narrative. By 1995, Elizabeth herself was facing a battle she couldn't win. Diagnosed with colon cancer in March, she kept the illness private until it was too late for treatment. As her health declined rapidly, she gave only a handful of final interviews, each carrying an undercurrent of closure. In these moments, her comments about Bewitched and its cast took on new weight, as if she were leaving behind carefully chosen words for those still wondering about the past. When Elizabeth passed away on May 18, 1995, at just 62 years old, fans were left with two intertwined legacies: the magical illusion of Samantha and Darren, and the unresolved, very human story of the actors behind them. And in that gap between fantasy and reality, the truth about Dick York, her truth, remained just out of reach. But there is one last detail, rarely discussed, that may be the closest thing we'll ever get to an answer. In the weeks after Elizabeth Montgomery's passing, those closest to her began sharing fragments of conversations, small remarks she'd made that now seemed heavier with meaning. One friend recalled a quiet afternoon not long before her death when the subject of Bewitched came up. Elizabeth had smiled faintly, then said, "You know, some things are better left between two people." She didn't elaborate, and no one pressed her, but the words lingered. Another confidant claimed she kept a small box of mementos from her years on the show, scripts with handwritten notes, candid set photos, and even a single black and white still of her and Dick York in a moment between takes. It wasn't framed or displayed, just tucked away. Whether it was nostalgia or something deeper, no one could say. If she had intended to ever speak in detail about York, about his feelings, their working relationship, or the rumors that had shadowed them both, she never got the chance. Her illness moved too quickly, leaving no time for memoirs or tell-all interviews. Instead, what she left behind was a patchwork of half-hints and subtle admissions, enough to keep the mystery alive, but never enough to solve it. For fans, that absence of resolution became part of the legend. The idea that Elizabeth Montgomery carried the full truth about Dick York, his devotion, their tensions, and perhaps a final act of kindness, only to take it to the grave, transformed their story into something larger than either of them. It became a puzzle with missing pieces, inviting endless speculation but never providing closure. And maybe that was her intention. After all, some stories aren't meant to be tied up neatly. Some truths are too personal, too intertwined with private pain and fleeting joy, to be laid bare for the world. So we're left with the image we started with, Samantha and Darren, frozen in time, smiling through a perfect TV marriage that hid far more than it revealed. And somewhere between the scripted magic and the real-life heartache lies a truth that only they ever knew, and that neither ever fully told. On screen, they were the perfect couple, playful, loving, unshakably united. Off-screen, they were two people navigating a complex mix of affection, boundaries, and the relentless pressures of Hollywood. Dick York's hidden crush, his devastating injury, and his abrupt exit from Bewitched all became threads in a story that stretched far beyond the show's glittering set. It was a story of quiet sacrifices, unspoken feelings, and moments that could never be scripted. Elizabeth Montgomery carried her part of that story with her for the rest of her life, revealing only glimpses in rare, unguarded moments. Whether she ever visited York in his final days, or simply lived with the weight of wishing she had, the truth was something she never placed on public display. It wasn't for the tabloids, the talk shows, or even the most devoted fans. It was hers, locked away with the memories of the years they spent side by side. And maybe that's why their story still grips us. It's not just about what we know, it's about what we don't. The hints, the rumors, the fleeting comments that suggest something deeper but never confirm it. In an age where every detail of a celebrity life is dissected and shared, their mutual silence feels almost sacred, as if they'd made an unspoken pact to keep certain memories untouched. What we're left with is an ending that isn't really an ending at all. Just two stars, bound forever by the roles that made them icons, and a truth that slipped away with them. Maybe that's the final magic trick of Bewitched, that even after all these years, it can still leave us wondering what was real, what was imagined, and what was hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that unanswered question is the reason their story still feels alive today, like a spell that never quite wore off.